Hey, this is Tabby in my lefty enneagram project. Enneagram is a personality style with 9 types. It's not deterministic. You have to think about looking at the high expressions of all the types. Some people talk about your childhood experience, but I think people really follow certain core motivations and desires. And there's also this very interesting relationship between types, these dialectics and integration and disintegration. So it's an interesting moving system. So think about the 9 types. That Enneagram has some old roots in Platonism. Think about the enneads, ennea, the enneads in Platonism. Think about 9 forms of energy. And we're going to talk today about Jordan Peterson, who is the one, this idealist, the perfectionist, who deals with anger and resentment, and they have these ethical gut ideals, these rules, to try to get them to this sense of moral serenity and not being condemned. And I'm going to look at how Enneagram 1, when it's stressed and unhealthy, all types have this disintegration line, where they incorporate the low levels of this other type, and they have this missing piece of understanding the complement of the higher tendencies of this other style, this other personality style. So some background about the Enneagram 1, the perfectionist. This is an advocate, a crusader, a teacher. Their basic fears of being corrupt, being evil, being defective. Their basic desires to be balanced, to be good, to have integrity. And they want to escape condemnation. They want to justify themselves. Think about how Jordan is out hectoring and preaching. These are my rules for life, and how they want to go out, and he's trying to justify himself and his principles so he won't be condemned. He senses the ideals and the rules changing, and he says, no, I need to have this pragmatic crusading for my ideals that will not make me condemned, because he fears that, he's losing his sense of correct ideals of gender and manhood and whatever. To give you a little more background, some other possible ones, definitely ones, you have Noam Chomsky, where he has his principles, this idealistic gut morality, this innate, almost platonic form of language in our head, this pre-existing principle, also these ideal structures of anarcho-syndicalism, which can create an ethical society, this moral striving. Think about Richard Wolff, how they have this pragmatism and reality of these facts and figures, but all coming to justify this gut activism and principle, which, for Richard Wolff is basically that capitalism is not giving the people what they need, and his values, maybe their jobs or survival, a sense of good life, right? Think about Sam Seder, Bernie Sanders. They have this practicality, right? They sort of have this moral barnstorming. They care about tangible, pragmatic process. And fundamentally, they want to find serenity, this moral serenity, justify their gut instinct. Now, they usually justify themselves as thinkers. Imagine Sam Harris, and how he's another one who says logic and reason. But really they're gut activists who justify what they already want to do. So that's why his facts don't really match up, and as they get unhealthier, they get into a lot of moral hypocrisy while still saying logic and reason. And it's important with the Enneagram types, people get sort of turned off, because a lot of the famous types, or the types that get expressed, are these lower tendencies, because they can be easier to see. But it's important to see the high expressions and lower expressions, and also what is the relation between them, what is the motivation that ties them together, so that we can kind of think about transformation. So at this higher one lens, you have this wise, realistic, pragmatic, discerning, noble, this balance, this seeing both sides of Nathan Robinson, this Chomsky scene. The Soviet had these problems, but also think about what the US did in this sense of moral calculus. You get a little less healthy and you start getting to someone like Liz Warren, where they sort of start to struggle with a lack of this subtle humanity, this sense of feeling and personhood. which I dissociate the sense of self and identity. I dissociate with the high, healthy level of Enneagram 4, my type, which is this romantic individualist. And the Enneagram 4, their basic fears of not having an identity, not having a sense of self or place, and their motivation is to find their purpose, their self, their identity. It can be this very artistic type and moody and self-conscious. Think Brando, Miles Davis, Marc Maron, this sort of constant peering in, self-reflecting at the kaleidoscope of emotions, and sometimes struggling with this buried sense of self because they sense that it's always flowing, this kaleidoscope of sensation and feeling and self. They have that sense because of the self-reflection. And as they get more unhealthy, the 4, they try and fix that into a heuristic while also feeling misunderstood and saying, nobody understands me, I'm this special person, and getting more and more fixed. So I at first was afraid that Jordan Peterson was this horrible 4, because he's talking about being the individual, being special, but as I'll look into a little more later, because of directions of integration, disintegration, he's not, but also he has no insight into the higher 4 level, where you get this discerning, wise, empathetic understanding of self and others. Think about Maron and himself and interviewing others in this sort of equanimous search for selfhood and this creative regeneration of self, this sort of portrait of emotional reality and community and self going forward. Instead, and also a 4 is sort of self-torturing. When they're unhealthy, they feel like a victim and have envy, but they also feel like they hate themselves and they've done something to be out of touch with reality, whereas Peterson uses this angry 1 resentment that things are not perfect, and he tries to impose rules. And thinking back to 4, higher, healthier, I'm thinking about Asad Haider and mistaken identity. And so think about the most basic motivation of a 4 is to find their identity, right? Even though they sense that's not a real heuristic. That's why the title, Mistaken Identity. And so think of this lower level of 4, which is so fundamentally afraid of not having a self, and they get more and more distorted because of this. They get envious, they feel like misunderstood victims, they feel other, they're desperate to be understood who they are, they feel different, they don't have this equanimity others have. Think about Maron and sometimes his envies being very central, his envy of Louis, his envy of these things. Also think about Edward Said, in this holy ideas tradition of Enneagram. The holy idea for his origin, and they struggle with the sense of melancholy. And think about his melancholy loss of his Palestinian self, this forced search for his holy origin, this original true identity. And at a higher level of 4, this can get into this rich hybridity, which Said expresses, this sort of understanding the borderlands and the interchange of identity and roots. And this gets out of that melancholy fixedness and into this more wise, discerning self. And so the Enneagram, which has, these ancient Platonic roots, you can look at the 9 types are expressed in all the different places. The Odyssey, which is the one Homer, what's the name of the guy? God damn it. But all the different places he goes, the opponents he comes up reflect one Enneagram style. There's also some Sufi roots, Armenian mystic roots, also Andean roots, and it has a lot of pieces in dialectic forms. And as I was saying, one of these are the lines of integration and disintegration. If you look up Enneagram, you'll see how all these lines connect. So for example, 1 connects to 4 and 7. It integrates to 7, disintegrates to 4. Actually, I was just listening to a podcast this morning about a book from 2014, The Birth of Theory, by Andrew Cole, which was talking about the medieval Platonic roots of the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, and if we come back to this 4, basic fear of having no identity, well, actually, I lost my place a bit. So Andrew Cole talks about how the Hegelian dialectic comes out of medieval logic traditions, for example, identity and difference, okay, and the one and the many, and I'll get back to that in a second. Let me loop this into Asad Haider in Identity Politics. So the fear of the four is having no identity, but at their highest level they express, maybe in a work of art, this regeneration of what is called in Enneagram the personal and the universal. So I want to think about Asad Haider and mistaken identity and viewpoint, how he comes at it from this artistic representation of selfhood that's personal universal. Asad Haider talks about insurgent universality, from the particulars into the all, and also think about how Asad Haider's talked about the definitions of identity. Identity is all that one is and all that one is equal to. So it's coming to terms with all the particularity of what one is and how that extends to the particularity of everyone else and finding the through line. This is what real identity politics is, identifying your experience as it flows in order to identify the experience and hear the experience of others as they flow and to find the commonalities and coming together. This is in the word of identity. This is in that original logic of the dialectic. And also think about Frederic Jameson, who writes Representing Capital, and he talks about how, with the capital idea, Marx, that capital doesn't have one identity. You have this issue of representation, of viewpoint. What is the identity of capital? And it's always shifting. You can never fully represent it. But the fours come back to this sort of personal, universal self-creativity to find the self for all and this self in the living community. For example, a novel, it could be reproducing your life of this self-creation, and you're trying to reach out, connect with other selfhoods, and find this universality. And so coming to this, Andrew Cole, talking about the dialectic of identity and difference, he cites Plotinus, and this very four trope of self-reflection. Fours are very self-involved, and Plotinus talks about the reflection on identity, and fours are always self-reflecting in identity. Ipso facto creates difference, this identity difference dialectic, because the moment I reflect, it moves like quantum, right? And this fracturing from the one to the many, from the personal to the universal, and the multidity of any identity, and mixing that with unity, but not over-unifying and having a false heuristic. And when I think politically, this is an important human move, to be able to see the full context and viewpoint of where I am as a self and a person, to be able to identify all I am, that I am the same as, identical to, and this extension outwards with sort of empathy and a sort of sensation of selfhood and emotion and root and origin. And so returning to the one, as mentioned before, the integration, disintegration, you meet up with the numbers, and there's an interesting dynamic because there's a symmetry. So when one is unhealthy and stressed, they disintegrate to a low 4. But on the other hand, a healthier, more balanced 4, once they're more sensitive to themselves and others, more emotionally insightful, they integrate to a healthy 1. They get more practical and discerning, not just falling into their fantasy world where they want to be only in touch with certain emotions and fix this sense of unique self because they feel out of touch with it. No, they get more relaxed in their self, and then they can get more into practical action, sort of from self-theory to the practical. Think about the relationship between Sam Seder, this Enneagram 1, and Marc Maron, an Enneagram 4. Sam Seder and Jamie Peck, this Enneagram 4, who Sam wants to be practical in the moment, but he lacks what they want, this sort of sense of self and melancholy and envy, but finding their place, and he's like, let's just be practical. And it helps typing, figuring out people's types, to see this low-high disintegration, because I was worried for a minute that Jordan Peterson was this nightmare 4, because a lower 4 gets very depressed at this sense that they're insisting they are special, they are unique, and he's trying to say, I'm the individual, and they're persecuting me. And he's trying to look for this origin and be special, the DNA of the mother and father. But he uses it in this hectoring one way, but again, the 4 is called the individualist, but he doesn't have access to the high 1. A 4 would integrate to a higher 1, not a low 1, But he has access to this low-level one, this angry, resentful badgering about the rules for life instead of this wise, discerning, noble practicality. And he wants others to follow his precepts so he can escape being condemned and achieve serene moral perfection and striving. And his 4 is this knockoff 4. He has this shitty sense of origin and the mom, the dad, but he uses it to hector and to set rules because he doesn't have many higher 4 resources of sort of actual subtlety and self-reflection. And my instinct is that lower ones, so in addition to Jordan Peterson, if you think about Sam Harris, Tucker Carlson, these moral principles come from this conserving ego place, this deep angry place where they feel their principles are getting lost. Logic and reason, Christianity, men and women. We can't have Tucker Carlson. Is diversity really good? What is your real principle, right? Like, is that rational? This call to rationality. Think too about Hillary Clinton in this sort of middle low place. We have to be in the center. This is the only pragmatic way forward. You're not being reasonable. And they feel like people are misunderstanding them and that they're condemning them. And so they start kind of getting this shadow problem as they get unhealthy with this low 4 of feeling like they have no identity and feeling like this victim. And so ones often have this gut rejection of this low 4 fantasizing self and wanting to be practical. You know, you'll see Tucker put a title about immigration. Facts versus fantasy, this very 1-4 relationship. But also will have this shadow need to find their identity, right? While using it as a rule. The rule is I'm special. Think about how Tucker's identity is a white man with privilege. Don't mess with that. Think about Sam Seder and his 1 morality and this sort of rejection of this melancholy sense of self-victimization. Think about Sam Harris, how he has this fear of death, this 4 fear of losing yourself, but he uses that to say, be atheist like me, logic and reason, the world is cold, right? Jordan Peterson feels his principles he's getting condemned, and he says we don't have balance, and he gets into this melancholy search for origin and DNA of the individual. And they don't have the resources for the higher because they're falling apart from a low 1. And so they go back to their core motivation to not be condemned and justify themselves and say, you're attacking me, I'm a victim. We need to set rules for we are the special people and you cannot take away our individuality. So it's this horrible mix of the 1 rule making with this 4 sense of being misunderstood. And now a 4 tends to self-badger and blame a lot of times deep down, whereas a 1 puts that out, right? But now a 1 integrates to the high 7, this sort of Sam Seder, partying, moving, thinking, Lula, Biederman. Whereas they often, because they disintegrate to this low 4, they will try to stay true to their principles, but they'll repress this 4 melancholy, this emotionality, which is a very important common dialogue, a dialectic on the left. Think about Jodi Dean, the theorist, and her principle of the Communist Party and her rejection of the Lacanian petit objet a, this sort of melancholy desire for another world, another utopia, but this sense of already feeling like we'll never get it, this melancholy sense of being cut off from source. Think about Blaise Pascal when he had this mystic revelation of God. I thought I was cut off from the holy waters. What did I do to be cut off? I never want to be cut off again. This trying to fixate a certain emotional sense of connection, but with this, it's hard to fixate, so you always have this melancholy fallenness from that and trying to control yourself back into that sensation. And there's this deep critique in the left to this 1 more pragmatic side that rejects this melancholy, fantasizing fixation on identity and self and what has been lost. This is a deep strain on the left, an important dynamic. Again, I think Sam Seder wants to be practical, and Jamie Peck wants to find her place in the world, and he has this gut rejection of too much Marc Maron identity, creativity, and victimhood. He says, come on, let's do the floor. And there's a lot to think about because there's just so many 1s in politics, so many 1s in the political discussion. I mean, You have Liz Warren, who, when she feels like she's being condemned about her identity, she goes to this low 4 place in a way where she's using this one strategy of facts. Let's find the facts to justify myself and not be condemned. But it's about wanting to be special, wanting to have this identity and feeling victimized and this envy of specialness. But she doesn't have the emotional resources to see the subtlety of what really forms a self and milieu and identity and viewpoint. Also think about Bill Maher, think about, it's interesting to see when different ones debate. Think about William Buckley, this one, this is what's right and wrong, you're an idiot, this resentment. But when he debates Chomsky, and see how you have the lower and the higher can look really different, and they both have a call to balance and come on, be real, are you being rational? But they can get into this false hypocrisy, but the low level's often calling out the hypocrisy of healthy ones, but they're wrong. I think about Bernie and Hillary as 2 ones, a nightmare. Not a nightmare, but they're both falling into different places of what is moral and what is pragmatic, and Hillary feels persecuted and angry that she's being told she's not pragmatic and ethical because that's how she sees herself, and then she's disintegrating, she doesn't have a sense of self, right? She doesn't have this emotional intelligence. But Bernie too also have this hectoring pragmatism, this rejection of identity, right? Which has its good and bad sides, because at a high level it can be very healthy where you have this balanced morality that isn't just in this fantasizing. And you also get these people like Sam Seder, Nathan Robinson, railing against other lower ones, against Tucker and Jordan Peterson, debunking Sam Harris. You have Richard Wolff, this other one, challenging Peterson. And you sort of have this moral calculus of society being fought for, because there are these moral crusaders and teachers who are fighting for the moral stakes of society, and you'll find different levels. So these lower ones in this sort of moral hypocrisy will say, well, no, you're not being pragmatic, you're not being morally correct. And again, one of the basic desires of the one is moral balance. And if you think about Jordan Peterson talks about this call for, he says, why is there evil in the world? This moral accounting, what is this dark side? He talks about Harry Potter, how his evil side is part of what makes him an ethical hero, this ethical striving, how you need this dangerous. So there's again this gut instinct, and he's using these fake ideas to justify what he already feels, which is we need to be dangerous men to be ethical, right? This balance. And Peterson also talks about the integration of the persona, this shadow side. But I think what he's really getting is this sort of dark, evil, low 4 persona, because this is perhaps a metaphor for the disintegration point, which is also called your missing piece, because it's when you're integrating to 1 to 7 to sort of your comfort point, me 4 to 1, is this healthy growth, and it's just a natural complement. But your disintegration point is a very important connection too for you, but it takes more self-examination and work to get to that higher expression of it. But when you have that, you have something very deep. And Jordan Peterson talks about this shadow side of your persona, so not just being an obedient citizen, not just being this one that's moral and this sort of other side, and you could say that's this persona of the 4, in fact, persona, identity for him, right? But he's repressing that because one's often in their desire to be good, perfect, and balanced. They will reject, they don't want to go to that dark, emotionally searching place. It's painful. I had a friend who was a 1 who would talk about his fear of death and jumping into the abyss, and he would rather live alone forever, this pure individuality, rather than, and have everyone else die, than die himself. And so, but he was also going logic and reason and atheism, so his perception of the melancholy hopelessness of the abyss and loss of self became this angry yelling at everyone to be an atheist, not unlike Sam Harris, and he also really liked Liz Warren. I'm progressive, we have to be practical. And so if they haven't integrated to a healthier sense of self and origin, this missing piece of the high 4, they'll return when they sense this loss of self. They'll come back to their low 1 with a sense of I alone know the truth, this rage, this false practicality for their moral serenity and their loss of self. And it's not as reasoned as they think it is, and they have all this shadow, need, and anger. And yeah, so that's my reflections. Hope you enjoyed. Jordan Peterson, 1 for Enneagram. This is Tabby. Peace out.